Hello, everybody. All right, I think someone's going to introduce us. So,
Hey, hello, welcome back from our break. It's great to see everyone ready for the panel. Today, Nuritsi will be our moderator for this panel discussion, and we have a mix of lovely Gnome and KDE faces to give us some great information on increasing users and revenue.
awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. And so to, I guess, further introduce ourselves, I thought we'd start off with some quick intros. So I will ask the panelists to each quickly tell us your name, where you're currently based, what open source projects you belong to or how you're affiliated with open source, and a highlight from this pandemic. Sometimes we focus on the bad stuff, so let's think about something good that came out of it. Let's see. Annika, can you please go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Anika, and I'm working for KDE right now as a marketing consultant. And I think this pandemic has helped us a lot. Right now, we're having this virtual session. And I think before we would have never thought about it, we might have traveled. And I think this has made a little bit of things easier for us.
Awesome. Thanks. I'll just go down the way that the photos are organized. So Cassidy, you're up next. Let's see. Yeah, hand waving. All right. Perhaps you can test or it's okay. Don't worry about it. We, as you figure out your audio settings, maybe. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah. So there's this leave audio button in the middle. That's really not smart design. Anyway, sorry. I'm Jos, and Josh. Yeah, it all works for me. I live in Berlin. I'm maybe semi all-time KDE contributor. Quite a while ago, mostly helping in the marketing team, and later also contributed to OpenSUSE. I currently head up marketing at Nextcloud. And for us, Corona has been, I guess, less disruptive than for most companies. So we already worked from home. And I think the highlight is a bit that we really helped a lot of companies, and I'm guessing also a lot of private home users to work from home, to work remotely, of course, while protecting their privacy, security, and all that. So people also care more about it now. I guess they're more aware of, like, if you suddenly have all your stuff, or you have to work remote, then people care more about how safe the data is, which I think is a bit of a plus, given privacy, being under threat. So.
Great, thank you. And I just will introduce myself too, just so that everybody knows who I am. My name is Nuritsi, and I'm based in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I first got introduced to open source really through GNOME and my work with Endless. And now I'm working on a lot of more like cross open source initiatives. For example, the Chaos Project, where we're trying to develop open source metrics. And a highlight from my pandemic is also kind of the connection. My sister, who has been based in Los Angeles, was able to come up and work from the Bay Area. And so it was so nice to see her for a few months. Really enjoyed my little sister. So we are going to dive right into these questions. I love that, you all are from organizations, that very much oftentimes, people will think of open source as being a place for developers. And I think in recent years, we've started to change that terminology into more contributors. And I just noticed that you all have great backgrounds or are involved in things like marketing, design, business, the legal aspect of things. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about how your backgrounds are contributing to the VOS projects that you're involved with, how important that is, and how it's contributing really to the Linux ecosystem's growth. And then how can we attract more people who identify, from backgrounds like yours? And I'll open it up to panelists, anybody who wants to start off. And if not, I'm going to kill you.
So, boy. So the problem is there are too many lawyers. I mean, it's a little bit of a joke, but it's also, it's interesting. I got involved in all this. So when I very first got involved when I first got involved, open source as a phrase was still a few months away from being coined. So when I got involved, it was free software. And we really thought that lawyers were really important, and that you needed them to help structure how people worked with each other, right? The licenses we thought were really central, and and I think the good news for the community, the bad news for me, though it's been great, is that I think we've realized that the lawyers should play a much more background role, right? Where we are there for defense, which the GNOME Foundation has needed a couple of times, certainly. But by and large, the legal tools are either mostly already done or much less relevant than we thought, right? That the other community aspects, things like marketing, we did have a GNOME marketing team briefly in the early 2000s. Suffice to say, what y'all are doing now is a lot more organized and a lot more powerful. And that's, I think it's actually really a good thing that lawyers are much less a focus than they used to be. So.
Cool. Thank you for that insight. Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think that KDE and GNOME's marketing over the last few years especially has been given more of a focus, I'd say. So we have some people who are involved in that. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that you're facing with marketing open source? Or some of the things that you've seen that are really positive and you'd like to see more of?
I don't want to barge in because I know Anika does, of course, marketing in KDE. But at least from a Nextcloud perspective, I can say a few things. I mean, in the end, when you're running an open source project, in the end, it's a software project like any other, and you have a kind of a battle for the hearts and minds of users, so to say, right? There are multiple solutions, and people have to pick. And plain and simple, they have to find what you have, and they have to get the idea that it fits what they need. So the very basics of marketing, which is just to communicate a product, is something you obviously need. And beyond that, of course, you have a huge advantage that often you have a big community, people who talk about the product, who tell other people about the product. And I think this is how open source or free software in the beginning became really popular. And this is still, I think, really core to how open source communities spread their software. I mean, it is for us. But you still need to go beyond that. I am a strong believer in a need for a commercial push behind open source projects. I think it's very hard to become successful without full-time paid people, and full-time paid people means, well, you got to earn money somewhere. You can, of course, rely on donations, but that only gets you so far. And that means you need to reach people who can pay. Now, obviously, private users can pay a bit, but companies tend to, be a much more suitable target. And yeah, I mean, how many companies are you going to get by, advocacy of private users? Some. Absolutely, you can't ignore that. But in the end, when you talk to a business person, it's going to be very hard to convince them of an open source solution without having some marketing, both materials, videos, everything, like the whole range. This is just necessary. So I think for an open source project to go beyond one or a few people coding in their free time, and to become something that really influences the world. And I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone, but for me, that's motivation, right? I want to make an impact beyond, I don't know, myself. If you want to do that, you need marketing, and you need people who write documentation, and you need basically everything beyond the code, because just code isn't going to cut it. My sense.
Definitely. Okay. And I wonder, I know that Annika, the KDE team has experienced growth in the marketing team. Can you tell us a little bit more about specifically, again, maybe how KDE is approaching marketing and kind of your plan moving forward for it?
I think for me, I will use myself as an example because I'm a very newbie for open source society. And for me, it was very difficult to understand how things work. So I keep myself as an example. If you're approaching a person who's not a Linux user, how are you going to actually ask them to join this Linux desktop environment? So I think now we are, as you know, I got in touch with you also, we are trying to reach out more of the local communities. How are they going to help us to reach out to more users? Because for open source society, you can't just have a simple kind of marketing. It's not just that you can just have promotions over the social media. That will be enough. That is not, because you need a snowball technique. You need people who can actually reference one another. So the best thing is, which I think a lot of communities have already done, ambassador programs and reference programs. For some it was successful, for some it was not. And for KDE, that's why we are starting the KDE network program. Hopefully we'll be able to roll out in a few months, and our pilot study will start from India. And the whole idea is to start from one user and who can actually bring on more users on board. So that's the whole idea.
Cool. I completely agree with you. I think when I first started at GNOME, I also tried to start a group in San Francisco specifically, and had a lot of women interested in joining from backgrounds actually like lawyers who wanted to get out of law, and people who maybe had taken a break in their career and wanted to start learning how to program, and thought that open source would be a great way to do that. And when I tried to explain what GNOME was, I was, new to the community too. I didn't have great stories and people were kind of like, okay, I don't totally get why this matters, or like what I'm doing. And so I think that we have already improved our stories, but storytelling is so important in this, and we have to find new ways to reach audiences that are totally new to this space and so may need more understanding of why it matters and how to do it, and rewards. Companies do that as well. So kind of along with that, thinking about Linux desktop technology is not necessarily the hot new tech that everybody wants to jump into, and paired with we have to find innovative ways. Have you engaged in any innovative ways to reach new users, or know of others that you think our communities should try? And I'm thinking of you, Clarissa. I know that you mentioned that you're starting a program around this. Maybe you can lead off and others can join.
Yeah, I totally can relate with you about trying to explain why do we contribute to open source to people who are not they don't live that day by day. So it's very hard to explain that for them. I'm not very good at making sort of a marketing and spreading the love of open source for people. So it was really hard for me to explain them that, so yeah, we are running this initiative that we want people to get engaged in open source, especially from Brazil, because we have lots of people there. Like, the population of Brazil is giant, but we don't have many people involved with open source. So we wanted to reach Brazilian community. We wanted to grow the Brazilian community in open source and give them autonomy to contribute to whichever open source software they wanted to. But first we had to talk to tell them what open source is and why should they contribute to open source. So it was a very big challenge, but in the end they got it, and most of them are getting engaged. And I think the most important thing that we did for them was to tell them that they are needed, that their work matters, and we need more people to take part on that, and that every work that, even though they are beginners, even though they are going to different fields like marketing or usability, they can get, they have something to offer to any community, because everyone has the capability of doing anything that I don't know, everyone has skills to offer to the community. So, and adding to the other question, I think, especially talking about usability, I had no background on usability. I was like the opposite that we expect. I am a software engineering student, so I was all like developing and stuff and coding. But I saw an opportunity of learning usability by doing usability tests for GNOME, and I had no background on design or usability or stuff like that. And I was able to just like I was a user for GNOME. I used GNOME for many years before I started contributing, and just by being a user, I was able to contribute to usability testing like a user, like a beginner. So yeah, I think anyone should try to learn a little bit about usability and run usability tests. So anyone has the skills to do it. You just gotta search for your field.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuting myself and I muted myself. I was just going to say, yes, I completely agree. And I love that idea that, you might have skills or superpowers that you didn't even realize, and just by being in an open source community or being exposed to this, you might say, hey, I can contribute in this way that I didn't think was possible. And you can start, a whole other side that you never knew was possible. So, that's great. And Cassidy, I know that, you're also involved in interesting ways to reach new users. Elementary has had some really great success. Do you have anything to add here? And if not, we'll just kind of move on.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, to attract new users especially, you really need to focus on the experience and creating the best product, period. People don't use software because it's open source. At least the vast majority of people on Earth don't use software because it's open source. You compete with that proprietary software by making a better experience and by competing in areas in which the proprietary software can't compete, which is, for example, privacy. You can never have a truly privacy respecting piece of software if it's closed source or if it's proprietary. So we need to lean into that and focus on creating the best experience you can, and focus on competing in ways that you just can't compete with the alternatives.
Yeah, I think people are plus oneing you. Totally agree. Cool. So one of the questions that I have is around collaboration. So, we're all doing our best to create, great experiences. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for, again, other backgrounds to get involved, product managers to come on in, and UX specialists, et cetera. But, as we think about increasing the users around the Linux app ecosystem, where do you see opportunities for communities to collaborate? And then what do you think is something that individual projects really need to take on them by themselves?
If I may speak a little bit from a kind of outside perspective, because we as Nextcloud, I mean, we are all people from the KDE and GNOME community in the company, or at least a lot of us are, as well as from other open source communities. But of course, now we're, well, a third-party project, and one of the things we do is we build an app, the desktop client, also mobile clients. And, you know, if you want to grow an app ecosystem, I mean, there's a pull and a push. You know, like there's a benefit of building an app for an app developer, which is, in simple terms, reaching people. And there's a cost, which is how hard it is to make an app available for the platform and make it work everywhere. And if I get to complain a tiny little bit, you know, there is, of course, still issues with standards. Like in our case, notifications and system tray. Like GNOME and KDE developed a standard for a system tray, but it's not supported by GNOME as far as I know. So our app, which uses a system tray, doesn't really work in a logical way for a lot of GNOME users. And that kind of issues, I mean, I get that the desktops and well, those who built the platform, so to say, they want to innovate, you want to move forward. You don't want to be held back, perhaps with legacy things, but that does mean you lose independent app developers. And you got to really balance that in a smarter way, and work with others in this regard, because this increases the costs. And you know, we all know that the user base of Linux desktop isn't great, isn't huge. Luckily, I think there is some exciting momentum. I have a couple of small PC vendors that seem to be growing and becoming more prominent. And there are the bigger ones, Dell and Lenovo, of course. I really kudos to the people who made that happen. I don't know who deserves the credit, but they really deserve a few pats on the back, because that really makes a sizable difference. I mean, when I got involved in open source, getting a laptop to work, I mean, I wrote blogs about it because it was weeks of work, and now you can just buy one from Dell and Lenovo, which are, you know, huge companies. So that's really helpful, I think. But yeah, for this, you have to offer a consistent single platform. Yeah, having a single website. Like if you want to develop for Apple, you know, you go to apple.com/developer or developer.apple.com, wherever they put it. But there's one place where you can get started, you know. And Microsoft, the same story, although they have, I think, 600 different UI toolkits and everything. But still, there is one way you can do it. And on Linux, there's a way for GNOME, but that app will not be smooth on KDE, and the other way around. Yeah, that's not good, and that should be fixed, I think, because you're splintering a platform that is already tiny even further. I mean, from a business point of view, any investment we do in Linux support is already quite a stretch, you know. If you then also have to do it for 2, 3, 4 desktops, only crazy people do it. We're crazy, luckily, but you know, most companies are not, and they don't. And you know, and if you go beyond that, I mean, I know we've done a lot with things like you know, Flatpak and all these things, and that helps, but they're also not there yet. You can't do browser integration, file manager integration, for example, from a Flatpak. Yeah, so if you get the Flatpak or the Snap or the app image from Nextcloud, you don't get this nice right-click menu in your file manager. Yeah, and we can't really fix that. You know, that's just a technical limitation. So there's also technical barriers that, I mean, again, yeah, that should get more attention, I think, from the people who built the platform.
Yeah, please jump in. You can unmute yourself and just go.
All right. So yeah, I have thoughts on this as well. I think growth of the Linux platform in and of itself might be a red herring. You know, we could port the whole world to Linux. We could have Android apps and Electron apps and iOS apps and Windows apps, and we could grow the Linux platform in that way. But to have sustainable growth, I think you need to actually have a platform. And Linux is not a platform, and which is fine. Like Linux is, there's this open source ecosystem, there's this Linux ecosystem, Linux desktop ecosystem, but there's the GNOME platform, and there's the KDE platform, and there's the elementary platform, etc. And we can all have similar and overlapping ideas and goals and opinions and go about things different ways. But really, I think to make a good experience for both users and developers, you have to focus on growing an actual platform. I know that's hard to hear because it also means, like you said, kind of splintering the Linux ecosystem further. But unless we say, all right, let's KDE, GNOME, elementary, let's all join forces, make one distribution, one toolkit, one platform, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. I think we really have to focus on those individual platforms as separate platforms. And again, we can still work together on things when it makes sense. But I don't know if it's realistic or worthwhile to say I want an app for Linux, and because that's so broad, that can mean so many different form factors and platforms. Whereas if you say I want an app for KDE, that's a much better target. I want an app for elementary OS. That's a much more simple target. And for cross-platform apps, they can say I want an app for KDE and an app for elementary OS and an app for GNOME, and those are 3 different apps on 3 different platforms. Just like a Windows app is different from a Mac OS app, is different from an Android app, is different from an iOS app. So I don't know that it's realistic for the foreseeable future to say a Linux app is a singular app that works the exact same everywhere. And I think we have to be okay with that.
Yeah, but you can't justify spending time on it already, with like a 3% market share. If you then cut that in 4, it's even harder. Like what person in a business can go to the boss and say, hey, we can sell 4% more if we do X amount of work. Like this is a conversation that happens if you want third-party apps. I'm sure, Elementary and GNOME and KDE can all build a new image viewer for themselves. Fine. But let's be honest, that's not going to be helpful in day-to-day work a lot. You also need more specialized apps. And if they have to rewrite the app or at least do a lot of work to target each of the platforms, then a lot of platforms aren't going to get targeted. You've seen this with Ubuntu. Most third-party applications, think of Steam, that just say, we support Ubuntu. If you get it running on Fedora and OpenSUSE, good for you. But we don't support it. Goodbye. Have a good day. Because they just target the biggest. And that's reasonably sensible, I think, from a business point of view. You can say, well, we don't care about that. All right. Then, there aren't going to be a lot of apps for you, and your users can then complain about that. But, well, that's because you didn't want to build a platform that works for app developers.
Okay, any final thoughts on this topic? We can go on for ages.
Yeah, we can go on for a long time on this. Yeah. We can literally go on for decades on this topic.
Yes.
I do want to point out that something I said in chat that I think is probably worth for some of the viewers who aren't paying attention to chat. There's some tension between Cassidy saying, nobody uses this stuff because it's open. They use it because it's, high quality or whatever. And Joss saying, only crazy people do this. And then pointing out that there are, in fact, crazy people who do this, right? And the motivation for those people is almost always about it being free, open, privacy protecting, et cetera, right? Like there are, I think if you look at the history of this movement, yes, of course, many of us care, and to reach a broad market, right? I don't think Cassidy's wrong, right? To reach more than the 4% of the market or 3% of the market or whatever, you do need to have a story that is bigger than, hey, you can open it up and see what's inside. But at the same time, I think it's a valuable tool that free and open source desktops have that Apple and Microsoft don't, is this ideological motivation, right? And so what do you, how do you, I've been trying to stay away from crazy because it has all kinds of connotations, but like, how do you cultivate and tend to that group of people who do believe in this ideological motivation? How do you grow that as sort of a sub-community within the larger community? Because that's a potent, powerful, intelligent, caring group of people that I think sometimes when we've had this pendulum about like, are we pragmatic? Are we ideological? Like, how do we make sure that we're keeping some of those core values there, because they do motivate people, and they do, it's really helpful to have some people doing things for irrational reasons. If everybody's doing it just for like the cold, sane, and here I am at a VC-backed company, right? So I'm like trying to do things for cold and sane and reasonable reasons, but like also, that additional push of, I really think it's the right thing to do, helps get some people out of bed in the morning, and helps, and if that helps people put in an extra hour of marketing or coding or whatever, that can be really powerful. That adds up over time. And so I would urge everybody watching this to make sure you do have to have the cold, pragmatic view, but like also figure out ways to nurture and guard that ideological strand, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the core of what we do, but it does have to be, it can be real and powerful if we take it seriously.
Yeah, thank you for that, Louis. And that kind of leads into one of the questions that the audience has asked, which is more oriented around monetization, but it's about, how should we start to monetize and still respect open source and privacy. There are things like, advertisements, donations, in-app purchases, etc., that can happen, but how can we move towards this while still upholding our FOSS values?
So there's nothing inherently inherent about free and open source software that means you can't pay for it, right? And there's also this myth, Daniel Frey, founder of Elementary, says there's this myth that open source software is all written by benevolent volunteers and that funding the development of software somehow corrupts it. That's something we see a lot within sort of the really diehard Linux kind of places on the internet, I guess. And I think we need to get over that. We need to get over that money somehow corrupts open source software, or that you can't ask for money. And we need to not be afraid to build the tools to allow users to give open source projects money. Right now, that's, I think, one of the biggest barriers, is that you go to an app store on your phone and you pay money for an app. You pay $1 or whatever, or you sign up for a subscription, and it's really easy and simple. But there's no way to do that on the desktop, at least broadly right now. At the Elementary App Center, we've started in that direction, but GNOME Software and KDE Discover, as far as I know, there's no way just to go click a button and pay $1. So I think we really need to focus on those pieces of building the tools to allow people to give open source projects money, and I don't think that is in conflict whatsoever with the free and open source values.
Okay. So, talking about ways that we can monetize and create rewards for, the development to continue, the creation of apps to continue, and then also, for sustainability. I'm wondering what are you all, using for yourselves, and what are some ways that we can continue to make the the development of applications more sustainable? I know some of you, like Louis, are involved directly in helping the FOSS ecosystem be more sustainable. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, let me give the sort of basic Tidelift elevator pitch, which is that, but it's focused on libraries, right? So like our basic observation is that all big companies are now software companies, and all software companies are open source companies. And so, you know, literally a $1 trillion industry built on top of open source. And yet at the same time, piles of this open source that these companies rely on becomes unmaintained every year because people aren't paid directly to work on it. And so they get a new job, or they get a puppy, or they get a toddler, and all of a sudden this side project becomes much less important. And then when the side project becomes important, it eventually gains security problems. It just isn't ported to new APIs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think everybody here understands that basic cycle. So our observation, inspired in part by Red Hat, which my other co-founders are all ex-Red Hat people. I'm technically ex-Red Hat, but I spent more time at SUSE than I did at Red Hat. The observation was, if we can measure this, we can capture what people are doing and pay out based on that. It's almost, you know, for those of you who are familiar with like Spotify and how they pay artists, similar to that. The intuition is we capture what you're actually using. We measure that, and we redistribute the money you've paid to us to developers whose software is being used, and we do that based on essentially, I mean, the short version of it is analysis of your package manager metadata. And and we require the developers to do basic stuff around security, licensing, all that. Basically, the enterprisey stuff that is sort of boring, that is not something you'd want to do on a Saturday morning for fun. And you know, we turn that into a revenue stream. The challenge for this audience, unfortunately, is that we just don't see enough usage of free software at the application layer, and we don't have a way to track it, right? And so our model, at least as of yet, doesn't really allow us to say, for example, you know, are you using the Firefox web browser, which is free, versus the Chrome browser, which is free, and you know, donate revenue based on based on that usage, right? And so it's a tough, you know, and especially for organizations that are still primarily at the desktop level, everybody's an open source software organization at this point, but that's all on the back end, right? That's not what developers are using in their day-to-day primarily. It's not what the business people in the organization are using day-to-day. And so extending that pitch up the stack, we would love to do it at some point, but we don't see, you know, quite where it fits yet in our model, which is really unfortunate because, you know, several of us, one of my other co-founders is Havoc Pennington, who some of you may recognize from, you know, vestigial docs on freedesktop.org. You may have seen his name in, you know, those kinds of things. Yeah, so it's a hard fit, right? I do wonder, you know, having also worked at Mozilla and at Wikipedia, I do always wonder whether or not some of that more user-focused, as opposed to, you know, at the end of the day, our Tidelift's business is very enterprise-focused, right? We are here to get dollars from very big enterprise companies and turn that into money for developers. I do wonder, you know, Wikipedia certainly to great success, Mozilla to less, but still not zero success, has turned their user bases, their human user bases, not their enterprise user bases, into revenue streams. And I do wonder if that's a more fruitful path for, you know, for these communities here, right, for GNOME and KDE.
Yeah. Anybody else on thoughts? I know, Cassidy, Elementary has the App Store, so jump in.
Yeah. So especially the Tidelift model is really interesting, and I've always been really fascinated by that. On the desktop, I think it's really interesting because I don't want to take all of the underlying work that goes into the desktop for granted, but there are very, very large successful companies who are very invested in maintaining and improving the Linux plumbing in general. So I think it's important not to get bogged down in, how can we ensure that every purchase of this app written by a starving developer also goes and pays for the Linux kernel, because those are two very different developers or development people in very different situations. And I think as the ecosystem grows, there will be opportunities to reinvest revenue once we actually have revenue for these apps. There will be opportunities to reinvest that into the ecosystem to make sure that our interests as platforms for apps are well represented within the Linux desktop. But I don't think we can pretend it's equivalent to say, for a $1 app from somebody who's just trying to make rent this month, that you need to make sure that whatever percentage of the Linux kernel gets funded and whichever percentage of glib gets funded from that one purchase of that $1 app from somebody who's otherwise not making any money. Yeah.
Sorry, Louis, please go first.
It's just a real quick point, which is that the only reason we believe that kind of trickle down works in the server space is because there's a lot of money in the server space. Completely agree with Cassidy that on the desktop space, taking a small pie and subdividing it into even smaller slices is a very tough sell. I mean, it's tough enough in the server space, and it would be very hard in the desktop space.
Yeah, I basically am completely on board with Cassidy and Louise on this. This is going to be quite hard on the desktop. On the other hand, a part of it is that the pie is small and there's a lot of money in the server. Okay, but if the pie were bigger, as in if there was more use, obviously there would also be simply more money. Now, I'm biased. At Nextcloud, we have internally looked at over the years various business models, and we really do not believe that there is much room for earning money on private users. There are a lot of private users of Nextcloud, like really a lot. There are about 300,000 to 400,000 Nextcloud servers on the internet, so people running an actual server. And that's obviously the vast majority of that is just private people running it on an old desktop or Raspberry Pi or a VPS somewhere. And we try to do a lot to make their life easier, to make it easy to update, to make it easy to find it, download it, run it. And we do not do anything to try to monetize it. We really try any idea that comes up internally that boils down to make money on private use. We say, let's not try that, please. Because we think that it is far easier and more effective to try and monetize bigger companies. And I think that same can be true for the desktop. I mean, if big companies, they also need a desktop, right? And they are currently paying for that. That's in the end what it boils down to. There is money getting paid for Windows and Mac OS, indirectly in case of Mac OS, but still. And okay, then you have a bit of a problem, kind of a chicken egg issue, I think, where right now there's just not enough of a movement there that you can build a business on it. I know both Red Hat and SUSE tried to have their, SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop, I think, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, I guess, Desktop too. They both tried this, and I think there was definitely some money made, but not enough to really sustain it and to really build up a bigger, pie, basically. Now, part of that is probably that, I guess at some point, I'm sure SUSE went for KD and Red Hat for GNOME, which is like, okay, do you have to split efforts there? But, right, this is, I guess, how this works, and you can debate for a long time whether that was smart or not, and what that did, but it didn't help, I'm sure. But then, even if you can, I think the challenge is the chicken egg here, because there just isn't enough critical mass to do this. Now, one thing I believe is that there's quite a bit of interest from government, interestingly, in pushing open source for privacy reasons, for digital sovereignty reasons, which is a fancy term they throw around these days, which just means controlling your computing, which is obviously what free software is all about. When you go back to the basics, it's about you, the person who or organization that runs the software, controlling it. And that is indeed really important. And right now we're in a situation where half the world is running software that is developed in pretty much one area of the world. And, you know, whether that's good or bad, there's definitely some inherent risk in that, I think. And open source is a prime way of fixing that problem. But of course, governments tend to love to invest through complicated, you know, grants and all that stuff. And I am very skeptical of that. I mean, it can work, I guess, but often, you know, getting money for 6 months and then it disappears again, this is not how you build a sustainable open source project. So a better way would actually be if government would do what it preaches. And what you see right now is that governments all over the world are putting millions, billions into proprietary software. How about stop doing that and put that money in open source? That would definitely, in terms of size of the pie, completely solve the money problem, because there's more than enough money spent in 1 year just by Europe on Microsoft Office licenses. I mean, there's more money going into that than I think all of open source on the desktop and even the whole stack below it spends in a decade. So there's money. It's just being spent on, well, it's basically just going to shareholders, because of course it's not like Microsoft is spending more than 1% of the money that's being paid for Microsoft Office onto the development of it, right? This is, the margins are insane. So I don't know, I'm kind of hopeful that at some point government will wake up and think, so right now we're spending, I don't know, 10 billion a year in just one country on licenses for something that actually could be developed for $500 million in 1 year or two. How about maybe do that instead? I don't know. It's one thing I'm hoping for. I mean, after all, you know, we thought, at least I thought for a long time, that, you know, no hardware vendor of the size of Dell or Lenovo is ever going to ship, you know, open source desktop software ever. And they do today. So who knows? Maybe governments will also wake up someday.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. You know, having worked at Endless for a while, we did actually approach government organizations, and I know that there are some governments that have, you know, started to use more open source, or they have budget for open source, but at the end of the day, you need support for it. You need people that are like actively there, like doing business development, and those relationships take a lot of time because government moves really slow. And I think that's one of the reasons why I personally feel really passionate about this topic, because I think that it's a great training ground for people who have business development skills or sales, or want to like go into like people who are not thought of as the traditional open source contributor can do so much to help. I know Alberto Ruiz had been, you know, really great at helping us find opportunities that, you know, we hadn't thought of at GNOME, and those are incredibly valuable. We need to get more people who want to do that, who excel in doing that, who are very people skill oriented, to go and form these relationships with governments and other, you know, organizations. So totally agree with you. And then I think that the challenge that we have, again, is around service and support, because at least in my experience, that is something that governments expect. And that can be quite, quite a lot of work. And, you know, in a volunteer-based organization, or mostly volunteer-based, you know, it's a little difficult.
I mean, to elaborate on that thought a little bit for people in the audience who haven't worked at those kinds of companies, it's not just that it's hard, it's that it's hard to scale, right? Something that we have used to our benefit in open source is, hey, a handful of us write software and it gets used everywhere. And, you know, new users does not necessarily mean I mean, it does in some cases, but it doesn't necessarily mean more burden on the developers. More users definitely means more burden on support, right? And that's where like support contracts and enterprise class support is. It's not just that it's hard to do well, it's that when you add a new customer, you've also got to hire and train and deploy a new support person, and the next customer means the next, and that's something that is not, to get back to where the conversation started, that's something that needs money, right? Like that is not, you can't really do that support, that kind of support on a volunteer basis.
Yeah, and then I think this, just to combine, both points that were just being made, I think there's also a bit of a sales pitch / attitude issue here, because of course, one argument for open source that's used very often is it's cheap or it's free, which is a horrible argument if you're trying to make a business, right? This is just killing. I mean, so often our sales team, and they're doing amazing work, but so often the main argument that the customer internally has used to deploy Nextcloud was save money. That kills any opportunity for us to build a healthy business that way. And the problem is, of course, a lot of people who love open source and try to promote it will also use this argument, which is quite awful.
And that's where somebody mentioned in chat the public money, public source argument that FSF Europe has been deploying a lot lately, and I think that's a terrific message and goes to your point, Joss, of the European Union.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we only have a few minutes left. I'm not sure this is the best suited for this group, but it has been identified that we need to have more emphasis on a space beyond the Linux App Summit where we can collaborate all together. freedesktop.org has been named as, I guess, something that we can try to amplify or to extend, something like that. And do you all have ideas for how we can continue this conversation beyond this space, or how to keep collaborating?
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think Free Desktop, it gets a bad rap of, it's not a standards body, it's not an enforcement agency or anything like that. But there's still a lot of really good stuff there. The Free Desktop existing is why there is some amount of intercompatibility between desktops, like when you click an icon, it opens an app, like fundamental things like that. So I think Free Desktop is probably still the best route. I think it needs maybe to be revitalized and maybe repositioned a little bit as far as what its goals are and how active things are and who's involved with those efforts. But yeah, having intercompatibility between desktops does improve things, and it lets us all kind of have our own visions for what the desktop is, while not totally wasting resources reinventing the wheel every time. So yeah, personally, I'm a big fan of the Free Desktop angle.
Okay, and
I'll
go ahead.
step back a second and say that there's a community at sustainoss.org, including a semi-active discourse forum that is a gathering hole for people trying to do the money and sustainability and open source discussion. It's very library and developer centric. But it could certainly, for folks around here who are interested in the space, it's certainly a great community of people. I they were trying to do meetups twice a year. Actually, the last thing I did, I think Sri was saying this in chat, the last thing that I did before everything got locked down was go to Sustain. And, I assume they'll be doing some online stuff as well. There's also several people doing podcasts around the space that may be interesting for the audience here.
Yeah, I want to second that. I actually myself have that on my to-do list to get more involved, because I think that there's a lot of just great people from both corporations and more traditional or just open source projects that are working together on this. And I think it's a great place to get involved. I see that you added another link in there, Lewis. I don't know.
The publiccode.eu is just for those who were the public money, public code slogan that I mentioned. Publiccode.eu is a site with materials and discussion of that slogan. I also want to say, actually, and this relates to Joss's point about free software is low cost. I will say, actually, my one concern with the Sustain OSS community is that often everything is phrased as a donation. And there are certain contexts where donations work. Like I mentioned earlier, for Wikipedia, donations work. But I actually my biggest concern with the Sustain OSS crowd is that the large amount of corporate participation, for the corporate folks, they never want to buy anything. They always want to donate. And there's a reason for that. And that's because they can turn off donations whenever. They can feel good about donations without actually building a sustainable community. And I think that's a message that we all need to push back on, right? That
And
this
taxes,
is,
I suppose.
yeah, I mean, taxes is, but it's not quite taxes. It's like voluntary. It's like, oh, look, there's a saying in the US nonprofit world of, oh, I gave at the office, right? It's like this idea that you donated once, and so now you don't have to think about it again, right? And you'll see this, there are a couple big companies in the Sustain ecosystem, or the Sustain community, who have made these big public pronouncements of, oh, we donate $10,000 a month to one open source project. And and guess what? $10,000 once is not sustainability, right? That makes you feel better, but doesn't actually help that community.
Yeah,
right?
plus it's
it's not bad for that community,
but it's also not much money. I mean, we get companies that reach out to us sometimes, like, we like Nextcloud, we want to support it, we have a donation. And then we sent them a quote, and the quote is easily 100 times what they were even considering to donate. And I'm like, yeah, but like our engineers get a normal salary. They don't get like 5% because they happen to do open source. Okay, I can't charge you $5K a year when you would pay $500K a year for a solution from a proprietary company. Why are we even having this conversation? And this is... this is not helpful. And it's in part we need to change the conversation. And I mean, companies have made progress here. I think a lot of companies and governments, they used to consider free software like freeware, and they had a rule against freeware, and then they said no open source. Okay, that time is luckily past. We're in 2020. This was 25 or something, and then they used it, but they saw it still as like free, it doesn't cost money. And this is something we still need to get rid of. And then we need to teach them, by the way, that when you run open source software, you should get a support contract. And then we're going to have to teach them, you should get a support contract with the people who built the software, not some random third-party company on the internet that just happens to know how to configure the software once, but can't actually help you when something breaks. Like, all these things are also a matter of communicating and teaching big companies and governments to understand, how open source business works. And honestly, once 80% of the Fortune 500 has an internal policy that when they use open source, they get a support contract with the vendor, I think running an open source business, even for desktop software, will become a whole lot easier, because suddenly you can just say, look, I make this application, be it Krita, like a drawing application or just a desktop. And, there's an internal policy. If you use it and rely on it, you want to have a contract. Excellent. We offer that contract. And for the server side, this is what Lewis is kind of doing, of course, offering this from what I understand. For the desktop, we need to teach a lot still, really a lot.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm sorry to do this, but we're out of time. So we're going to have to continue this conversation in the hallway, or, I had seen some people post that they're going, or promise they're going to have blog posts coming out sometime. So keep an eye out for those. Thank you so much for joining this panel. There's lots happening in the chat, so if you haven't had a chance to look at that, please do. And I'm sure there will be a lot of follow-up also exploring the free desktop option that we've mentioned a couple of times. I will end it at that. Thank you so much. And Allison, back to you.
Thanks so much,
Bye.
Nuritsi.
Thank you.
It was great
Thank
hearing
you.
from all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. Up next on our great schedule for today is a lightning talk by Alexander. Alex, are you here with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great.
I think I need to be made producer, presenter too.
You are. Let's get your slides uploaded, and you can start whenever you are ready, Alex.
All right. Oh wow, that doesn't look very good. Oh well. So can you? Well, so it's supposed to like the gray triangles are supposed to be like alpha blended and stuff, but whatever. All right, I guess we'll start since we're. So that's gonna be a pretty short talk, focusing on like non-technical stuff for Flatpak seen from the perspective of like an application developer and not necessarily an end user. So I think most people know what Flatpak is. It's kind of an app store system. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, because much more interesting than what it is why it is. I had like a bunch of high-level goals that are not really technical, that are more of a solution to how things work in the community and how we develop on the Linux desktop that I wanted to fix. And the first goal I had was to improve the user-developer interaction. In the traditional model, and whenever I say traditional here, I kind of mean the distro model. If you are an app developer and you want to do a release, you put a tarball somewhere and you send a bunch of mails and tell a bunch of people about it. And then you sit back and wait for distro to find your tarball, package it up, and release it to user. This sometimes happens directly, sometimes like you have to wait a lot of time. And then your users get it, they notice it crashes. I mean, there's a software, it happens. You report it upstream, or you report it to your distro typically. And there you have like some overloaded distro maintainer that eventually sees your bug, notice that it's like an upstream issue, so you file the bug upstream, and then you can see it, and then you can fix it, hopefully. And there are a bunch of issues with this. The most obvious one is that you might not get your app packaged. Maybe it's just too French for most distros to care, or maybe just takes forever for it to get packaged. Maybe your users are on Debian stable, and Debian stable don't get updates until like a stable release, which is every 4 years or whatever. And if you do get packaged and have feedback, it gets delayed because there's this intermediate, the maintainer of the distro, that has to handle all the input. And once you get it, it's delayed. It might be hard to reach the individual or the user that filed the bug, or maybe he filed the bug against the current package version, which is something you fixed bunch of fixes a long time ago, but the users don't see that. So the goal with the Flatpak model is that you are in control of releasing to users. So when you release something because you fixed a bug, it goes directly to the user, and the users report things directly to you, and you get like non-stale information directly from the user. And if you fix something, you can push a fix the same day, and you have the user just run update and verify that it's got fixed. So there's a lot more advantages here. Like, not only the obvious one that you can reach all the users, but it's also like a much saner way to interact with users that can improve the community and the way we develop software. We can basically make better software if we have a better interaction model. So the second goal is to separate the apps from the operating system. On no other system does like the app come with a system. But in the distro model, everything is a package. The OS is a package, the apps are a package, and everything comes with the operating system. And if it doesn't come with the operating system, it's just not there. It's just not possible. So there's some obvious problems with this. You can only use the things that are packaged. And that's what people notice. But there's also other issues that affect how the community works. Like, you can only, like, you're not just limited to using the apps that are packaged. You're also limited to using the distros that have the apps. Like, you can't pick a random new distro if it doesn't have all the apps you need. And that means all the distros have to package all the apps. And there's a lot of work in making a distro. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the OS space, but it gets drowned by this requirement for everyone to package everything. That just makes it hard to innovate or work on the interesting part of operating system development. If you were to use something like Flatpak instead, you can share the work of maintaining and the apps. So like, the upstream of the apps do the work of packaging, and the distribution can focus on what's actually interested in the distribution world. I think that's much more important actually than the availability of all the apps and all the distros. Like, we can separate these things and make them they are not the same. They should be two different things. So the other thing is that we want to protect users. And Linux is a Unix, and Unix is historically considered a secure operating system. And I mean, that's not wrong. It has a bunch of security features. It's just that those features are not necessarily what you want. Their goal is to make you not be able to install printer drivers. Like, if we're talking about a modern laptop where you run on your personal system, the only thing that the Unix multi-user system, permission system, brings you is you can't do stuff that you would like to. It doesn't actually protect you in the way you'd expect it to do, right? If you run a game that you just downloaded, you don't want it to be able to read your mail, or steal your Bitcoin, or what have you. I mean, it's just, there's no isolation whatsoever to protect you from or your data, which is what you have on your home directory, basically, from the app, or or protect the data of one app from another. There just isn't any in the traditional Unix environment. So what we want is the way to isolate an app so that it cannot affect things that we don't want it to, but also we can control what it does and ensure it doesn't send spam on the network or whatever if we don't want it to. Obviously, we have a 30-year-old history of software, and it's not meant to be sandboxed. So all software that we have is not going to work in a sandbox environment. So Flatpak has a very pragmatic approach to this, where you can punch holes in the sandbox. And a lot of people give us a lot of flack about that, but in practice, it's more interesting to be able to use apps than not. But long term, we want to make the sandboxing solution work, as well as possible, so that apps can migrate to that model. So those are kind of like the high level goals, and I want to continue with some concepts and ideas that you get that you will see a lot when you start developing on Flatpak. So the first concept is that of runtimes. Applications depend on something called a runtime, which is really just a word for shared dependencies. And dependencies are things like files, like you have a library file that you share, and sharing it means we only store it once, both in disk and the disk cache. But it also means that you can share the maintenance of the core dependencies. Like app developer aren't necessarily super interested in glibc versioning or hardcore low-level features like how you make the GL drivers work. So forcing those on app developers would be a bad thing. So runtimes is a way we can avoid that and shared maintenance. And they're parallel installable, they're versioned, you can have many of them. Each individual app can test against one and choose when they want to update to the new version. There's no flag day where everyone has to move or anything like that. It's up to each individual maintainer. And if you do get updates, they're separately. So like even an app that doesn't get updates gets update for the runtime, which is where most of the core security problems might show up. So that's good. Another concept that we see a lot is sandboxes. And the Flatpak sandboxes are built on something called bubble wrap, which is really just a command line interface to the kernel APIs that we have for these. C groups, namespaces, seccomp, that kind of stuff. It's similar to what Docker uses. The main difference is that we have automatic integration with all this kind of stuff that the desktop requires. It just sets up all these sockets, and it has filter, dbus access, and it sets up the DRI drivers in the right way, and all those kind of low-level things that apps eventually will need. And then we have the concept of permissions, which really is just about punching holes in the sandbox, right? So we show you during installation, this app will require these holes. If that's okay, you can install it. You can actually then override it, even though your app required network access, you can then override it to not let it have it. I mean, in practice, this probably just breaks the app, but it is possible. But those are kind of static permissions that are set on launching of the sandbox. We also have something called portals. And portals is more like a name for a concept of dynamic permissions, where you have something running outside the app that does interaction with the user and controls the access to things like do you want the app to have access to a camera? The camera portal would be something that asks the user to pick a camera, and then this interaction grants permissions to the calling app. The most commonly used example is the file chooser, where the entire file chooser would run outside of the app, and only the final selection would be passed back to the app. Flatpak Builder is a tool we have, which is how most Flatpak apps are built. It's not really a core part of Flatpak. You can and some do build Flatpaks in other ways. like basically, since it's just a file, a bunch of files, you can basically create a bunch of binaries in the right directory and produce a Flatpak. But most things use Flatpak Builder. It has a JSON or YAML manifest. It builds stuff using Flatpak, so it's very reproducible. It runs on any distro. It uses runtimes again to build, although they are a custom style of runtimes called SDK, which is full of development tools. So here's a typical. This is a very small manifest for building an app. And then we have FlatHub. If you want to, basically, anyone can create a Flatpak repo. We think that's very important. However, in practice, everyone basically uses FlatHub. It's better for everyone, both developers and users. I guess my time is up. I don't know if there's anyone after this, or if we have time to do questions or something.
We absolutely have to do questions. We have a break, so you can answer as much as you'd like. The question in the shared notes is, are there any plans for hand and distribute individual services, Flatpak, or another tool? Could system service help? Feel like a gap in comparison to Snap and traditional methods such as Deb, RPM, etc.
Yeah. So obviously there's completely non-desktop things like running a web server or something, and in that case, I think we're just not interested in competing with that, because the things that Flatpak does well, which is integration with a desktop, is not interesting for those kinds of apps. And on the other hand, if you look at the tools that are available for that kind of thing, which is Docker, Kubernetes, all these clustering things, the things they do is not something that Flatpak does, like port forwarding or complicated network setups and automatic scaling and all that. We are not interested in doing that, so we don't want to compete with that. I mean, I guess there is an overlap where you have a desktop thing that kind of runs as a service in the background, and there's also the command line thing where some command lines are just server style things, and some are more like Midnight Commander, which is more like an app that runs in the command line. So there is these corner cases where it is possible to run command line apps in Flatpak. We have some interaction with them to try to make them work better. We create wrapper file that you can easily alias into as a command line or like alias, so you can easily run them. But we do have things like a portal to automatically add a start on logging to the desktop. You can start up a background thing. I think we do have portal that lets you add that, but you still have to kind of launch your app once, and then it can ask the desktop to have an auto start file. Could we do better than that? Possibly. Is it interesting? It's certainly not in the focus of what we're working on, but there might be things we could do better.
All right. Well, it looks like that. Oh, we do have a second question. Great. Okay. Second question. Now that Flatpak 1.0 is out and is becoming more stable, what's the next big feature? Or is it more around tools around it, such as portals?
Yeah, I mean, so actually the next version is going to be kind of a large change, but it's mostly in internals for scaling better on the network, because FlatHub is reaching like 1,000 apps, and it's going to be going to be important to be able to keep going as the size goes up. So the next release will have kind of a large internal changes, but it might not necessarily be a very visible change. That being said, I guess we have some new features that are interesting to look at. More better support for different types of network namespacing. Like right now, network access is an all or nothing thing. We're looking at maybe using some kind of NAT-like filtering or something, and there certainly is a lot more work in the portals side of things, and even like Pipewire and things in the larger ecosystem, rather than Flatpak itself. I think as we get most features and things basically just work, I expect the development speed of Flatpak itself kind of slows down, and the things around it, such as actually working on the runtimes, and the portals and all that stuff. One thing that I think kind of ties back to the previous talk is that we have some initial work on the technology for authentication and payments of Flatpaks, and I think it would be interesting to have a way to pay for Flatpaks, but that's mostly done on the technical side, and all that has to be done is on the actually doing it, and there's a lot of legal issues and actually having payments working and all that I think is something really important to get done. But again, it's not necessarily in Flatpak itself, it's more the stuff around it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for your talk. And we are leading into a break, but please feel free to chat in the public chat here or head over to the hallway track to continue talking more face-to-face. In the meantime, we will be taking a 5-minute break, and we will be back with brickless battery saving with Ubuntu Touch, presented by Dalton. Thank you again, Alex, for presenting about Flatpak, and I hope you get to enjoy the rest of the last schedule with us.
Yeah, sure. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
All right. Ellison, is it, am I allowed to put my presentation up now?
Yeah. Are you able to upload your presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me do that.
So we'll be coming, I think 3 minutes more.
Yep. Should be uploaded. That won't replace the one that's currently on, will it?
It will. But are you
Okay.
having any issues at the moment?
No. I'll just wait.
Okay, great. Hi, Dalton. I think you can start uploading your talk.
Okay.
Yeah, we have about 1 minute to get you introduced, so you can actually start.
There we go. Do I sound too loud or anything? Or are we good?
No, you're fine. We just have to
Excellent.
make a presentation in a few minutes, and then you can start.
All right.
Hello, everyone, and hope you had a nice break. Like, we have great conversations happening in the public chat, which is really interesting. And so for the next talk, we are going to be having Dalton. Sorry if I have not pronounced your name correctly. And he's going to be talking to us about brickless battery saving with Ubuntu Touch. And I hope you all enjoy it. Over to you, Dalton.
Thank you, Regina. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Brickless Battery Saving with Ubuntu Touch. This is a talk that's all about the tools that we can use to make Linux on mobile devices just as popular and just as useful as Android and iOS. That's a pretty big one, I know. I'll be talking about what Ubuntu Touch does to save battery and what, well, everyone else, meaning Android and iOS, does now. Hi there, I'm Dalton. I'm the development manager for Ubuntu Touch at the UBports Foundation. Ubuntu Touch is the open source replacement to Android or iOS. If you're interested, you want to learn more, you can head over to devices.ubuntu-touch.io, see if it works on your device. You can find us on Telegram at UBports, or if you want to join us on Matrix, you can find us at #ubports:/matrix.org. I love researching, observing, and explaining technology to other people. I love going back in history and seeing why we do things the way that we do today. And I did a lot of that kind of research for this talk, seeing how people in the past managed to save battery on devices that were much less capable and had much smaller batteries than we have today. The talk itself today is all about the impossible situations that users ask us to fulfill. And it's about the eternal truths that we can use to actually fulfill those requests. Basically by fooling our users into thinking that we did the impossible for them instead of actually doing the impossible thing that they requested. It's a talk about learning from those who came before us, including, well, BlackBerry, Palm OS, Mamo. But I'm going to stay really, really high level in this talk. I want to start a discussion with other mobile Linux operating systems, that's a mouthful, about how we can manage to save battery for all of our app developers, how we can help developers do this with us so that we actually give users what they want. This talk will also answer the eternal question, why is Ubuntu Touch so weird? Anyone who's used Ubuntu Touch before and tried to run like Firefox or Telegram desktop on it says, well, why doesn't this work right? Hopefully this will do a bit to explain why. At the base of it all, the problem that we have on mobile devices today is that people want impossible things. They want a task that they start to run until they stop it. They want it to run always and forever. For example, if I were to install an email app on my phone, I would expect that I get email until the end of time on my phone. And anytime that there is an important message that I receive, I want to be notified about that. Same for Telegram. If my friends or my enemies are trying to contact me on Telegram, well, I want to know about that. I want to be told about that. And if I buy like a smartwatch, I expect that that thing is always in sync with my phone. If I'm getting a notification, it better be on my watch too. Time better be up to date. And I expect that to be done without manual intervention, which is kind of the important part here. Sure, we can pull or refresh whatever we want, but that's not too useful. This is something that we usually refer to as always on or constant connectivity, where our applications are always available, always connected, and always up to date. The problem is that we also want to get long battery life while having all these constantly connected things going on. And there's a little problem called the laws of physics. Every task that we do on a CPU or a GPU or a network, some network hardware, takes energy. And we have limited energy available from the batteries of our devices. So if we just run tasks always, forever, we don't actually end up getting good battery life. And that's a problem that we have on Linux smartphones today. You can either choose, like with the Pine phone, to have a useful device that receives notifications from more than just SMS and phone calls, or you can have a device that lasts longer than 12 hours on a charge. And that's not a very good compromise to make. That's the old way of compromising things. That's how we've been doing things since 1986 on the IBM PC convertible in the PC space. Yes, I said that I researched back really far for this. Might be worth a blog post, what I learned sometime. Either your laptop is running tasks, it is getting your Telegram messages from your friends and enemies, it is receiving email, or you shut the lid and you're not receiving anything anymore. The laptop is effectively off. And that's a problem that we have persisted on the smartphone. We need to get around that. And we can try to do that by just saying, well, let's just not compromise. Let's just let apps do whatever they want, whenever they want. And in Linux, we have this really great thing called runtime power management, or opportunistic idle, which means whenever your device isn't doing something actively, it can idle. Everything that doesn't need to be running isn't running, and you save energy that way. But we end up with some problems when we try that. We don't hit idle often enough. For example, on my Dell XPS 13 9370, which is the laptop I use every day, if I were to close all of my applications, all my Nextcloud stuff, and just leave Wi-Fi on, and leave it connected, it receives 65 hours of battery life with the screen off. That drops about half once I open Telegram and Discord, IRC Cloud, Element, and Thunderbird. And I only get 26 hours of battery life with the screen off and never turning on. I never received a notification during this time because I'm a sad, lonely person. But that battery life dropped by half. So if we could say get 1 day of battery life on a phone once we run all of those apps and actually get notifications like we expect on a phone, we're only going to get 12 hours of battery life. And on the Pine phone, we're only able to do 12 hours of battery life without aggressive power management, which is something I'll talk about in a little bit. And then if you do something wild and crazy, like open up a Chrome tab with CNN.com in it, no ad block, and just leave that running in the background, you get 9 hours of battery life, at least on this XPS. This isn't a very good experience at all. That is a really short for something that is suspended or the screen isn't on. And that brings us to some eternal truths about saving power on computers. Idling is good. When we're idle, we use less power because we're opportunistically turning off pieces of the system that we don't need. But idle means idle. It means that absolutely nothing can be happening in the background. And that can be a problem for our current applications. They don't know when to stop processing so that the system can actually be idle. Easy for me to say. Another eternal truth of power management is that it takes more energy to go from idle to running than it takes to go from running to rather busy. Going from 0% CPU usage to 1% CPU usage is a higher jump than going from 1% CPU usage to, say, 25 or 50% in terms of the amount of energy that you're burning off into the atmosphere. And therefore, it's better to idle less, but for longer periods, than it is to idle more for shorter periods. When we look at the power usage of our devices, or the CPU usage even, we want it to look more like the graph that I have at the bottom of the slide, where there are huge valleys and huge peaks, rather than a lot of hilly landscapes. Because as you can see in that slide, this is actually the power usage of my laptop. When it's in idle, there's a huge peak from going from no CPU usage to some CPU usage. And that can amount to a significant amount of battery power used. The problem that we have is we assumed that users actually want constant connectivity. They want their tasks and their applications to be running always and forever. But there is an easier solution that actually is much harder to pull off in practice. I always want my applications to be up to date isn't the same as I want my application to be running all the time. It means I want it to fool me into thinking that my applications are running all the time. It just needs to be a good enough illusion of constant connectivity, not actually constantly connected applications. So then we need to compromise the other way when we talk about saving power on mobile devices. You might think, well, we need to tell applications, okay, so Discord, you're running right now. Element is also running right now, and it's going to check for its messages every 5 minutes or so. So you should check for your messages when it checks for messages. That way we have longer valleys of idle. The problem is applications don't need to care about other applications running on the system. That's not fair to an app developer. That just makes them implement a lot of stuff they don't care about. Luna asks, could you just update fast when the app starts to be active? No, not really, because you want applications to be sending you notifications like I just got on my phone now when people message you, even if it's just sitting on a desk and appears to be doing nothing. So what we actually end up doing in practice then is suspending apps whenever they aren't in use. Whenever an app is focused, it is not paused, and it knows I can process whatever I want right now. And then, when an app isn't focused, we pause it. And does that mean that there's just no worries? Well, not exactly, because there are things that you want to do in the background. You want to check for emails, you want to update chat lists, and you want to notify the user if anything exceptional happens. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but It's worth noting that if we suspend applications in idle, we go to a state where we know when the system is doing something and when it isn't. It's a system managed state, and that allows us to do aggressive power management, like manually shutting off the phone or putting it into suspend and waking up a little bit later when apps requested to wake up. That's how we get good battery life on the Pine phone, is by not actually having it in idle, but having it in suspend, and just fooling you into thinking it's only idling. Now, this will make people upset because they want to run the same apps that they run today on their phone. They're going to say, I wanted real Linux on my phone, not this thing that you're giving me. Trust me, I hear this every other day. The thing is, they aren't really saying, I want the exact same apps that I have on my laptop. They're saying, I want the same experience from these apps that I have on my laptop. I want Telegram to run, and I want it to tell me when I have new messages. That doesn't necessarily mean that they want the same Telegram desktop app on their phone and their laptop. It'd be cool if they did, though. If the Telegram desktop app was able to work when it was suspended in the background. We start giving applications back the ability to run in the background step by step. And that allows them to create the illusion of constant connectivity. Whereas, well, devices are kind of useless when everything is suspended, whenever the screen is off, we start giving apps back the opportunity to run in the background. And this is something that we schedule as a system rather than as a bunch of apps trying loosely to work together. The problem is that whenever we make a more convenient option, a more flexible way for an app to run in the background, it becomes less efficient. The more that app developers are able to dictate exactly when their app runs in the background, the less battery we have. So that's a trade-off that we need to be aware of. Also, the more clever we need to make our illusion, the more that we suspend in the background, the better battery life we get. But it's harder to implement those clever solutions. We then go, so we're walking back the restrictions that we placed on app developers, and we're walking them back in phases. First off, we make the required background services, the things that basically everyone wants from their smartphone. We make dedicated services to provide those applications. Next, we create push services, which allow application servers to tell the device when they have data to send. From there, we go on and create background extensions, allowing applications that were in the foreground to run in the background for a short period of time. We move on from there into maintenance tasks for things like refreshing your RSS feeds in the background when you don't have a server component that can tell you when there's something new to see. And finally, we end off by implementing the easy button solution, and that is actual real daemons like we have on current systems today. I would recommend implementing in this order, and well, Ubuntu Touch is currently on the path. We have the required background services and the push services that allow us to do this kind of thing, and to a point kind of have the background extensions. But this is just as much a proposal for how Ubuntu Touch is going to continue developing so that our app developers get their expectations met and their users' expectations met, just as much as it's a recommendation for how everyone should do this. Basically, what I'm saying is we're probably going to do things this way, whether people join us or not, but we would love to have you join us. Let's see. Yeah. We start off by implementing the required background services, the things that people will want the absolute most. And we do this by, well, seeing what users use on their device most often. We target the things that they do most often on their device and why they want their apps to run in the background. The first one of those is media playback. People want to play audio or video even when the screen is off on their device or the application playing the audio or video isn't in the foreground. People want to upload and download files. Well, apps want to do it for things like creating a social media post, They want to upload files even when they aren't in the foreground, because that could be a long-running task. The user could get bored and switch away while they do it. We want to provide location updates to applications. This is something that Ubuntu Touch doesn't do yet. The other two are things that it does. But if an application is using location services, it wants to be updated when it's in the background when the user moves. For example, if you have a run tracking application, the user might be switching applications and running while browsing the web, or they might have turned their phone off, which is more likely. And the app should continue receiving location updates when that occurs. And then finally, people want to create alarm clocks so their device wakes up and wakes them up when they request it. Excuse me for just a moment. Ooh, much better. Those are our required background services. And once we have those in place, we're able to provide the experience of an iPhone 1 in 2007. Well, actually the iPhone 3G in 2008 when they opened up the App Store to developers. From there, we move on to what iOS 3 added, and the iPhone 3GS debuted with in 2009. We're only 11 years behind now. And we create push services. Push services flip the script on client devices. Whereas usually, when you're running Telegram or Discord on your devices today, they ask the server, hey, do you have content for me? Do you have content for me? Do you have content for me? We instead make the server tell the client device, I have content for you. This is much more efficient because the server already knows that it has content available. Why doesn't it just make the client aware of that instead of the client needing to check in, even though there might not be new content on the server? It's kind of like a publish and subscribe model, except instead of polling like you would do in RSS, you get pushed the information that there's new data available. We make the server tell the app, I have data for you. This can enable a lot of experiences. In fact, implementing a push service, which is done by creating a client service on the device, which holds a connection, a single, usually TCP connection, to a server somewhere, that is the push service, and then app servers tell the push service, I have content for this device. The push service tells the device, there's content for you, and the device can then pull the content from the application server. Implementing these isn't easy, but it allows us to do things like, well, get notification cards even when a device is seemingly asleep and off. It allows us to grab information, like if you had a newsreader app, like an RSS feed app, and it had a server component, you could have the server tell the client there's content for you, and then as soon as the user opens the application, their news is available for them. They don't need to wait for it to refresh. So not only does this enable being able to do things in suspend, it also enables apps to continue being refreshed even though they appear not to be running. Of course, there are some cons to this model. Of course, first off, the actual push service itself is kind of hard to implement. UBports already has a push service for Ubuntu Touch, but it's based off of some test code from Canonical when they were developing Ubuntu Touch. And it's not the huge, big scalable solution that Canonical originally had. But it's also centralized, whereas there are new technologies coming up, like Web Push, which enable decentralized push services, where your client subscribes to your server, and it tells app servers, hey, you should send notification content to my server. Whereas with a centralized system, it's just, there is one server, everyone subscribes to that, and if you don't like it, well, you can go away. That's not ideal, especially for use cases where maybe you don't have internet access, maybe you're a company that is air-gapped on your network, but you still want to provide these solutions. I think Web Push is the way to go for this. It is a W3C, I think, standard that is in progress, and it's already implemented for Firefox. So we can take some of that implementation and reuse it. Of course, with Ubuntu Touch, we already have a solution for this, so that's future stuff where we're going to be replacing that. But I do plan on it happening because Ubuntu Push, while it's wonderful, it's nearing its time. Also, your app servers need to be centralized in this model. You can't have apps that are only available on the client and have no server component. I think this might be okay. I think that it might be okay for open source projects to start having hosted services components that you can choose to run yourself that talk to maybe an applications or a push server that you run yourself, or maybe one that someone else runs. I think it wouldn't be bad for open source projects to run hosted components like that, especially if we want to talk about open source projects maybe getting services revenue. We just talked a little bit ago about increasing revenue to open source projects. That could be a possible way, is by having them be services organizations that provide push services for your application. But that's getting way off. I'm sorry. I need to move on. At this point, we can enable most, if not, well, we can enable most use cases on mobile. We can enable things like RSS readers with services components. We can enable voice over IP applications by having the voice over IP server tell us there's a call incoming. And we can enable just getting notifications from Telegram and stuff. But there are some use cases where none of those really work. So we move on to background tasks, actually allowing application code to run in the background. Because up to this point, we've usually not been running application code. We've been running centralized daemon code on the device that then chooses to tell applications specific updates. With background tasks, we split common work that applications want to do in the background. And we know that they want to do this because they do it in Linux desktop applications. And we allow applications to do this. We've split this kind of work into three main categories. Work that the user requested would happen right now as your application is transitioning to the background. And then work that applications would want to happen sometime in the future. Doesn't really matter. And finally, work that applications would want to have done at an exact time in the future. It's worth noting, as we go down that list, the more flexible options give you worse battery life. So if we're giving app developers more control over exactly when they run their tasks, we need to be really careful about scheduling those. Otherwise, we ruin battery life for the user. And that's bad for both app developers because their users complain that they're getting bad battery life after they installed their app. That's not fair. And, well, it's bad for the system because they say the system has bad battery life. So as much as we can get applications to use the services I'm talking about first, rather than the ones I'm talking about last, the better. We start with background tasks that we want to happen now. These are things like rendering a 3D scene in Blender. You kick off a render and then you get bored, so you switch off your phone or you head over to the web browser and watch some funny cat videos. Or compiling software, Visual Studio Code. Or transcoding video before you upload it to a chat service because someone just took a mean video of you and they want to show you. On iOS and Android, this is fully possible. They both have this implemented, and of course they have everything I talked about before implemented. They give you a few minutes after you're in the foreground to finish your work. And if you aren't able to finish your work in that time, don't sweat it. Pause your work, and then notify the user that you ran out of time and they need to come back to your app to resume. Android makes things a little bit more flexible because you can just notify the user that you are continuing to use more time, whereas on iOS, you need to say, please come back, we didn't finish what you asked us to do. Just a bit of a difference of opinion between the two platforms there. We move on to background tasks that you want to happen some nebulous time in the future. These are really inflexible because basically you're telling Mr. God King system, please do this thing I am requesting you do at some point in the future. And then the system chooses to schedule that at some point that is useful to it to minimize wake-ups, to ensure that it's safe to use the data connection, to make sure that the user isn't present so that we don't ruin their experience of their foreground applications. You would use this for things like cleaning up your database or refreshing app content, like if you have an RSS reader that is local on the device and you need to go out and check all these RSS feeds, you might use a task like this to do that, because it doesn't really matter that the user gets their content immediately when it happens if they haven't requested push notifications. It just matters that you don't take a long time to refresh when it's time for the user to open your app. A good scheduler lets you do things like, I only want these tasks to run when the device is on charging. iOS allows you to do this with background tasks, and you have absolutely no control over when iOS does these tasks for you. You basically say, I want to run this machine learning algorithm, and the system says, okay. And it never says anything again until it's done. Android allows you a little bit more flexibility again with Work Manager, and you can constrain your tasks to run when you're on battery, when you're on Wi-Fi. You have a lot of options there. And then finally, you have background tasks that you want to happen at an exact time later. These are the most flexible, but they give poor battery life. You say, every 15 minutes, I would like to refresh email so that I can notify the user when they have new email. And I don't have a server that I can use to notify the user when they have new email via push service. On iOS, you can do this only if you are Apple. You have no other options. But on Android, you have some options. You can use Work Manager scheduled tasks to get an approximate task completed. This would be best for email because it's not essential that the user gets their email every 5 minutes exactly. Instead, we can allow the system to schedule tasks as they work. For example, if you schedule something at 1:01, you schedule something at 1:02, and you schedule something at 1:03, well, the system can just say, well, why don't we run all those things at 1:03 to save more power? Android has two options for this. Work Manager scheduled tasks are approximate, and Alarm Manager you would use if you wanted an exact task in the future. Although, with Android 8 and up, there's doze mode, which actually makes your exact tasks run at some point in the future, unless you say, no, really, this needs to happen at an exact time. Again, these are only examples of implementation, not exactly, we don't need to follow them exactly, but given that both iOS and Android have 12 years of experience on this, I think we should take heed. When literally everything else we have provided has failed, we give applications the opportunity to make daemons. And these are services that run all the time in the background. These are really unsafe because they make it impossible for us to do aggressive power management, because we might end up conflicting with what the app wants to do in the background. So basically, you just have to hope that the application developer made safe backgrounds, or made a safe background service. We have to look at the most common reasons why people would use these, why developers would create apps with these, and try to solve them. For example, it might be an issue of not being able to launch an app at the right time to respond to events that happen on the device. For example, if you're Nextcloud or Bacula, and you want to back up a user's content exactly when they take pictures or modify stuff, well, then we might want a better content model where a saved file is able to notify multiple applications that there's new content and launch them, so that they don't need to run all the time. However, there will be some cases where there's just nothing we can do, like decentralized and latency-sensitive applications like voice over IP, where you have 30 seconds to understand that there's a call coming in, or you've missed it and you've failed. Voice over IP is really about the only thing I think of for these kinds of apps, but there are of course more, because I am small-brained sometimes. And of course, finally, there are the applications that will expect incoming connections, like an SSH server or a sync thing instance, where you can't go to sleep anytime because at any point, anyone from anywhere could say, I would like you to respond to me now. And basically then we have to say, well, if your phone is a server, it gets battery life like a server. Like 30 seconds because it has backup battery for the hard drives. And apologies, lapse of judgment there. So to recap, people want their computers to run their tasks forever, but they also want good battery life. And these two things are in constant conflict with each other. So we need to think about some of the eternal truths of power management. If we're idle, we can save power, but idle means there's absolutely nothing happening in the background ever. And the state to go from idle to running uses more energy than going from running to busy. So the more tasks we can schedule at once, the better. Applications have trouble making that kind of thing happen themselves, and we don't need to make services that like tell applications everyone else is running. So we start by suspending them absolutely, and then we help them to create the illusion of constant connectivity rather than genuine constant connectivity. We start by suspending all applications, and then we give app developers the tools they need to run in the background the way that their users expect, so that they don't get the, I wanted real Linux on my mobile phone snark. I want to do this together. Like I said, Ubuntu Touch is probably going to go this way, whether people join us or not, because these are the things that our users expect, and these are the things that our app developers expect. If you want to talk more about this with me, you can find me at brickless@daltondur.st, or go to daltondur.st/LAS2020, where I have all the slides from this presentation hosted. Or you can join us at UbiPorts. Go to forums.ubiports.com, open up a thread. I'd love to talk about what I got wrong in this talk. I'm at UniSuperbox over there, or Twitter, at Universal Superbox on Twitter. Again, I'm really passionate about this kind of thing, about saving battery, and I think that it doesn't only need to be something that happens on desktops. I will take questions now. Or on mobile phones. I think this can also be something we do on desktops to allow more than just our mobile developers and our mobile users to get this kind of battery life. Excuse me. Okay.
Hi.
I'll take some questions now.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. It's actually really interesting, and I know a lot of people also had so much conversation about it on the public chat. And so we have a couple of questions here. The first is there a standard for push notification? Will it work for services like Telegram or Google?
So that is one particular problem. There is kind of a standard for push notifications. Actually, there are multiple. There is a web standard for push notifications called Web Push, which is a app server, push server, and push client specification. That's probably where we're going to look, because that's where the most developers are going to be putting their effort into, but they'll still need to implement special cases for applications on mobile devices. So they'd create a web push client for their web app. They'd also need to make one for their Ubuntu Touch app, or sorry, their Linux mobile app. Got
Okay,
Ubuntu
thank
Touch
you
on
so
the brain.
much. So the second question is, what are the battery implications of having potentially multiple wake-ups for multiple decentralized push services versus the single wake-up with grouped notification from a centralized push service?
That is an excellent question. It is something slightly that you need to benchmark, but generally on desktop Linux now, we have the case of multiple different push services as opposed to one single push service. So like, I'm pretty sure, though I can't look at the code, Discord is doing exactly this. They open one WebSocket connection to their server, which allows the server to tell the client you have new content, instead of actually asking, do you have new content for me every few seconds? So the battery implications of having multiple decentralized push services are the implications of battery that we already have when you are running applications on a Linux desktop.
Okay, so we still have somebody trying to type a new question. So let's quickly take the third question. Does Ubuntu Touch use C groups for managing resources of apps? If not, from the audio talk at last, it seems like it could help for management of suspending apps, RAM, CPU time, and etc.
I forgot to mention this in the talk. Yes, we do. We suspend applications via C groups. Canonical started that with Ubuntu App Launch years before we're talking about doing it now. But yes, Ubuntu Touch already does that, so apps can have multiple processes, and we suspend all of them at once and resume all of them at once.
Oh, great. Thank you. So let's take the last question. So will this kind of power management system be available also for laptops and desktop Linux?
Boy, I sure hope so. I would love to have better idle battery life on my laptop. And basically, that's what it comes down to is if we have this kind of thing available. On desktop, we don't necessarily need to suspend all applications in the background. But if they can better say, I want to run work in the future, like I want to update my application code at some point in the future. When your laptop is sitting on your desk suspended, it can receive that new application code, like Discord needing to update sometimes. You don't need to wait on it or manually restart the application. Your laptop just does it while it's sitting on the desk.
Oh, thank you so much for your talk. I particularly enjoyed it, and I'm sure a lot of people as well. So he has stated that you can contact him if you have more questions, and other questions can be discussed in the hallway as well. So we have the next talk is going to be happening in about 5 minutes. And thank you so much once again, Delton. It was nice to have you speak to us today.
Thank you. I noticed that someone in live chat said that I didn't have the link to the talk live. I apologize for that. I forgot to push the commit to Hugo.
Okay.
It's now uploading and it's going to rebuild the site. It'll be up in a couple minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All
You
right,
can
thank
also,
you,
you can also
everyone.
have that continuation of that talk on the chat as well, that people are going to continue with you. Thank
Yeah,
you very much.
I'll stick around. Thank you.
Yeah. So Elo, we will be having the next talk in about 5 minutes with Bart. Bart, are you here? I think I gave you the presentation, right?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. Apparently microphone works better when it's actually turned on.
Okay, great. So we can use this few minutes to continue our conversation in the public chat, which is actually a great conversation, really. Hi, Pat. You can go ahead and upload your talk. We have about 2 minutes just in case you're having an issue.
Sure thing.
Hello, everyone. So we're going to be having the next talk in about less than 1 minute. We're going to be having a talk on Flat Earth, the States of the Union by Bart. Sorry, I do not know how to pronounce your name properly, so that's why I just had to shorten it. I hope that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And yeah, so over to you.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. And actually, let me share my camera because it turns out it might be better to look at me as well. Can you see me? I hope you can.
Yes,
Yeah,
we can
so
hear you.
welcome to my living room and good morning or good evening, depends on when you live. My name is Bartłomiej Piotrowski, and just as Regina said, it's most likely not pronounceable to you, so just feel free to call me Bart, like Bart Simpson. Maybe a little bit less creepy, I hope. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about FlatHub, not just about what have we been doing for last year, but also what FlatHub is in general. Yeah, a few words about me. I have been Arch Linux developer for past 9 years, making and maintaining a lot of packages. Probably more than anyone have ever wished for. Professionally, I'm working on infrastructure in general, currently on GNOME Foundation. But I'm also helping up guys with Linux App Summit. So there is that. So let's move on. So I assume that most of you know what FlatHub is, but let's talk about what FlatHub is trying to solve. So let's imagine for a moment that you just wrote an app for Linux. Let's say it's something that is not probably a game changer. I don't know, an app for making a perfect tiramisu or in general cooking recipes. And you are pretty much sure that everything is ready and your app is great. But then after a few months of staring at your GitHub, you realize that no one is using it. So you start looking at various Linux distributions and how to actually put your app into repositories. So you start, let's say, from Fedora, because that's what you are using daily. After copy-pasting this and that from random documentation and blog posts, you arrive at this point. Very, very easy stuff, right? Everything is obvious. License, summary, bunch of weird sections that run possibly macros, you don't know, but because you copy-pasted this, nobody has time to actually understand every line of this, because lots of this is just common knowledge among package maintainers. So everything is great. Your package RPM is ready and some people are able to install your app. but then someone else comes and asks you for a Debian package. So you have managed to create a package for Fedora, so what can be hard about Debian, right? Well, this is just 2 pages of table of content for Debian packaging documentation. So after reading all of this and creating a Debian package and Arch Linux package, Manjaro package, and every single other distribution, you realize that all you have been doing for past 9 months is making packages. So you are no longer a developer of software. You are now a package maintainer, and that's what you are doing for most of your time. So that's probably not what you hoped for when you wrote your small tiramisu app, right? So the goal of FlatHub is to be place of your application, which is accomplished by using Flatpak. If you have listened to Alex's talk 1 hour ago, I think, then you know more or less what Flatpak does, so I won't be repeating a lot of this. But the general idea is that FlatHub is the build and distribution service for your application using Flatpak, given that someone else takes care of all the infrastructure and all the knobs that you would need to care otherwise. This is accomplished by very simple JSON or YAML. So there is very few magic commands involved. So this is a very, very basic manifest that you could use to build and run a GNU Hello app. This is actually using Flatpak Builder in the background, which is a single command to do all the fancy stuff that Flatpak does under the hood. But the general idea is that it's simple. It's JSON on YAML, just a bunch of lines without any shell scripts or anything else. And yeah, so when you have this and you actually manage to get this on FlatHub, then or any other store using Flatpak, then you basically build it once and run everywhere, because Flatpak is portable tool. Then you can use it on any Linux distribution, whether it's Ubuntu, Fedora, or Chrome OS, or Alpine Linux, which is completely different from usual Linux distributions that people are using. Then everything should work just fine. So just so you don't need to actually bother with building your own Linux distribution to build your own app, there is a common runtime called Free Desktop SDK, which is a base runtime with GTK and all the other base Linux libraries. And on top of this, we have GNOME and KDE runtimes, which are also maintained separately as separate project, although as usually some people are helping out everywhere, which is absolutely great. This way we can ensure that first of all, you as an app maintainer don't need to think about whatever runtime is, and someone else is handling security updates and bug fixes and everything else. However, as an app maintainer, you are not limited to just what runtimes provides, but you can also bundle specific dependencies that only your app needs. So you don't need to care about OpenSSL, but if your application needs libtiramisu, then you are good to go to bundle this. Yeah, and the most important part about Flatpak, and in a way about FlatHub, is that Flatpak is not tied to single store. So while FlatHub is de facto place to get your app built or get your apps from, then there is also an elementary store on the way, and Fedora also has its own. So Flatpak itself is independent, and FlatHub, while obviously, again, some people work on both stuff, it's not driving Flatpak development. And FlatHub itself, on the same note, is completely independent community project with lots of people involved Some of the companies donating time are Red Hat, Endless, or CodeThink, and also multiple hardware sponsors or services sponsors help out with FlatHub, which is Mighty Beasts providing some base servers that are serving the repo. Also Fastly, which does the CDN, or Equinix Metal, which donates all the build infra. There's obviously many more companies helping out either with Flatpak or FlatHub or runtimes, or helping out with various services that FlatHub is using, which we are all thankful for. But it's not possible that I will remember everyone. So sorry if I forgot about you, and I'm pretty sure we are listed on our website. So this is what FlatHub is. Let's talk about what we have been doing or plan to do in the future. So this is a graph of FlatHub applications from September. The latest graph is a little bit wrong because we broke the API used to calculate available apps. But the bottom line of this graph is that we have a steady growth ever since FlatHub started. And we are currently at 961 applications. And in fact, there's a little bit more because since I created the slides, we have added 2 more. And there's a number of apps available only in FlatHub beta for various reasons, like Chrome, but also Chromium, Brave browser, and few more. So we are getting pretty close to 1,000. Whether we will actually get to 1,000 this year, we will see. However, the number of apps doesn't mean much if you have no users. So let's see at something more interesting than just number of the applications. This is the graph of FlatHub downloads, which is, well, very unreadable because the traffic differs depending on the available updates, and then it's also non-trivial to calculate when someone's actually installing a new app or just updating it. However, the gist of this trend is that more people are using FlatHub since we started, which obviously is a great thing. More, or actually better place to check whether we have more users or not would be CDN provided by Fastly. So here we go. As you can see, the graph is increasingly growing. The black lines are the moments when I was trying to improve something in the configuration, usually breaking something, which is, you can see here, these slows in the graph. This is usually me breaking something. Yeah, but things are pretty stable these days, and yeah, we have only more traffic nowadays. Yeah, and the funny thing about growth is that at some point we just couldn't keep up with the traffic. So at some point our servers decided that we no longer are able to serve all the requests that were coming from the CDN. So as you can see, this is called mislatency in CDN terms. And this growth of mislatency was just causing errors, pretty much meaning that we were unable, or actually you were unable to install new applications or runtimes. So with my infrastructure hat on, the biggest changes here is that we actually work properly these days, and everything works fast when you, for example, try to download something bigger from FlatHub. Yeah. The biggest addition this year is Firefox, which has been in the works for like 2 years, I think, with many people involved. So nowadays Firefox is on FlatHub, on both FlatHub Stable and FlatHub Beta. And it's not maintained by us or some random shady guy who submitted this, but just by Mozilla themselves. So new versions of Firefox are published on the same day when the release happens, and it's actually plugged into Mozilla's automation. So when new, I don't know, Windows installers or Linux tarbos are uploaded to FTP servers, it's also pushed directly to FlatHub. I'm actually using this since February, and it works just great. I literally removed Firefox shipped with Fedora because why wouldn't I? It's Mozilla's Firefox works just fine. There's also a beta version available in Firefox in FlatHub beta. So if you are interested in testing new features, then please give it a shot. And in the future, we also plan to ship nicely and developer edition, so you can test basically full life cycle of Firefox with 4 co-installable apps. Yeah, so basically everything is great, right? Graphs are growing, new apps are being submitted and published, and there is nothing to complain about. Yeah, so my opinion, usual opinion, is that everything could be better because I'm from Poland, and if there's a single thing we are good at, it's complaining. So let's have a look at what we plan to improve or what could be improved, but there are no answers yet. So one of the changes you likely haven't noticed because it's completely hidden stuff is that we have a new backend, which is why we broke graphs of new apps that Andrew can tell you about in the chat. The new backend is written in Python, so this is actually great because more people can contribute. The old one was in Java, and it turns out that most of Java developers are apparently busy with writing enterprise stuff instead of contributing to open source, so that's good news. One of the changes that new backend brought was a new search, which sounds great, but results are pretty terrible. So, for example, if you go to flathub.org right now and type video into the search bar, then you are pretty sure that you will see PTV on the very bottom of the results. So there's a lot of room for improvements, either by, I don't know, switching the tool used for providing search or whatever else. I'm mostly hammering servers and not writing backend services, so I'm always open to hear some suggestions. The other thing is the website. Website hasn't changed much since FlatHub exists, which is, again, not a terrible thing because the website itself looks great. However, it could be better. So some folks from the community are working on new website and new design, which will look more like GNOME software or KDE Discover. If you zoom in on the slide, you can actually see the actual address where it is. However, it's obviously not being automatically updated on new updates or anything like this. This is just a proof of concept how things may look in the future. And on that note, the details of the apps will also look differently. This is more or less how it currently looks like. So a logo, short description, screenshots, longer description, and some additional information and URLs to various websites. The current idea is like this. However, this also brings many questions of what could be also included. So, for example, GNOME software and KDE Discover have access to ODRS, which has some reviews. Then the question is whether we really want to show some random reviews when there is no easy way to tell whether someone reviewed the app on Fedora or Debian or Arch or actually from FlatHub. Then we are also wondering how to show console applications, because that count of apps from before didn't include them, because at the moment we are ignoring existence of CLI apps. And then some applications also have extensions, whether they provide some fancy features for chat or I don't know, plugins for viewing YouTube videos in Totem that's currently completely not displayed on the website, hurting discoverability of features. Yeah, so obviously we will see. This is all work in progress. I see Michael complaining about screenshots. That happens. Sorry. Yeah, so that's about user-facing part. However, one thing I'm very unhappy about is the general developer experience. So, for example, this is how the submission process looks nowadays. So you need to fork our main Git repository on GitHub, then create new branch from specific branch called new PR, add your manifest there, commit, push, blah, 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 then create a new pull request to that original repository, making sure that we have pressed the good button for origin branch. And then you are waiting for the review from me or for other people that are reviewing new submissions. And then when new build kicks in, it turns out that for some reason you are missing icon files or you are missing meta info file in general, then Arch64 also fails to build. Something else fails to build because you have no network access. Then it turns out that you have left lots of static libraries in your application, meaning that your app is much bigger than it should be, or because you are not very interested in tracking numbers, you forgot that there is a newer runtime available, so you have using the old one, which might be not maintained anymore or for long. So to actually fix that, I'm thinking about preparing some, I don't know, linter, but this is very, very long, very long subject. So our documentation is poor. There is no linter, so we are actually going line by line, looking at the YAML files, doing review phase, and then leaving comments that something is wrong or could be done better. And for submission, that's again, my slides are not changing. I'm talking still about the same stuff. I will change slide in a minute. Yeah, so we could provide a web UI for easier submission using GitHub API, for example, or maybe just some simple upload form. Yeah, this is basically something that's very open to discussion, and we would love to hear how the ideal process would look like, maybe based on your experiences with Google Play or Apple Store. The other thing is that when you are a maintainer, you could probably use more automation, because at the moment you are pretty much on your own. So when new release is out, which you might not know about, you should bump it, or at some point we will produce a warning that your runtime is unmaintained, but it will be displayed only to users and not to you. So what would be cool is to actually notify maintainers that there are new runtime releases. CVE checker. So when you are bundling your dependencies, something could be checking whether they are outdated or not. This is currently missing. There are various tools that are providing such features, but we are currently not using them at all. And in the results, some people complain that apps are shipping outdated libraries and so on and so on. And the last thing that at least I, as a developer, would personally be interested in would be that when I create a new release on my original repo with the code, then something picks it up and tries to figure out whether it builds on FlatHub or not, and then just leaves an open pull request that I can accept, and tada, it's done. So, obviously, being a community open source project, we need help. So, this is, again, vast subject. Most important thing, obviously, is that we want new applications. So, if there is something that you are using or would like to be using, but your distribution is not packaging this, please submit your app. However, first talk to the applications developers. And this is actually kind of chicken and egg problem, because we technically could be rejecting applications that are not accepted by upstream developers. However, we wouldn't have applications at all then. So doing developer advocacy job is also very important. So poking upstreams why they could be using Flatpak and why it's great is very important job. Yeah, as I said before, documentation is also terrible. So if you have any general remarks about documentation or would like to write a proper documentation for us, that would be much appreciated. And development, of course, because I'm terrible at this, and while we have some people working on that, then it's always nice to hear what could have been done better. And if you are already a maintainer, please reach out to us, because sometimes it's very hard to know what is wrong when you are not outsider. So being here for over 3 years working with FlatHub, I take some things for granted. We all do. So if you have any feedback, even very general one, not nothing specific, but just, hey, your documentation sucks, please get in touch. That's gonna be very helpful, even without details. Thank you. I assume there are questions in the shared note. Yeah, my name is Bartłomiej. That L with slash is W in my language. It's pretty crazy. Don't think about this stuff for too long.
Hi, thank you so much. Okay, yeah, thank you for your talk. It was quite engaging on the chat and interesting as well. I see that you started with the first question. Of course, I also want to know how your name is pronounced.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I'll just go on to the second question. Are there plans to provide devs who use FlatHub to distribute apps to get a report on how many downloads, how many clicks on Donate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are plans for almost everything, and we are actually moving slowly towards having a proper statistics page available to anyone. There is a raw data available on the website. I have it somewhere in the slides here. Here in the bottom right corner is flathub.org/stats. So this is raw JSON files that you can use to produce a graph or whatever, but we plan to integrate this into the website.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question is, how long does it take on average for a project to get reviewed?
So nobody is technically paid on working on FlatHub, so it usually takes a day, 2 or 3, but rarely the longer than this. We usually have some feedback, so it's a little bit of ping-pong game until we arrive at some acceptable solution, but it rarely takes longer than a week.
Okay, great. We still have more questions coming up, so I'm just going to do them as fast as I can. So what is the workflow when you already have the Flatpak JSON files in the app's Git repo?
So Yeah, the workflow is pretty much, I have described this in the slide somewhere, which is not ideal, but it is what it is. So you fork the main FlatHub repo, add your files there, and then submit this as a pull request. And then eventually we will create a new repository under FlatHub organization on GitHub where only the manifest should be stored.
Great. So we're on to the fifth question. What is the current project governance?
Yeah, so that's a little bit tricky. We have had a call on governance few months back with GNOME and KDE folks, but a little bit like with any open source project, it's a duocracy. So if someone comes up and does the work, then he's usually the one deciding about something.
Interesting. So I think the last question is going to be, has any projects been removed from FlatHub?
From the top of my mind, we have removed an application that Cassidy from Elementary did because it had been submitted without his permission. I don't think anything else has been removed.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bath. I think I will have to keep calling you Bath for now until I'm able to pronounce your name. And thank you for your talk. It was quite interesting and so many engaging discussion on the public chat. So if you have more questions for Bath, you can reach him out and also continue the chat on the public chat. Right now, we're going to be going on 10 minutes break. We're going to be back by 19:05, where we'll be having the next talk on women interface guidelines. So for now, we can continue the conversation, take some tea, take a walk, a stroll, and we'll see you back shortly.
Thank you. See you.
Hello, Fabian. I just gave you the presenter, right? You can try to see, upload your slides just in case you have any issues, please let me know. Hi, Fabian, can you hear me? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. It's time for the next talk. Next talk is going to be by Fabian, and he's going to be talking about woman interface guidelines. Hi, Fabian.
Hello.
Over to you, please.
Hello, my name is Fabian Riedmeier. I'm going to talk about human interface guidelines and the role they play in an ecosystem, how they help with consistency and speed up development.
Hi, sorry to cut you off. I think I can't hear you well, and I don't know if others are having the same issue as I am.
Okay,
Okay, seem like they can hear you. Great.
I'm trying to. Is it better now? Is it good now?
Yes,
Okay.
good now.
Okay. So I'm just gonna start again. Hello everyone, my name is Fabian Riedmeier. I'm going to talk about human interface guidelines and the role they play in an ecosystem, how they help with consistency and speed up development. I've been working on KDE's human interface guidelines for the last couple of years. My work is primarily focused on improving the structure, presentation, and the existing content, and not so much on creating new content, creating new interface patterns or UI elements. So just a short what I'm going to talk about. First, what is a human interface guideline? Then I'm going to show a couple overview of some existing human interface guidelines, talk about the role of human interface guidelines in an ecosystem, and take a more detailed look into aspects of human interface guidelines. So what is a user interface? It's a space where interactions happen between humans and machines. This is a very broad definition and covers a whole lot more than just computers and mobile phones. But it also covers every kind of heavy machinery, operator controls, or industrial processes. The user interface typically consists of some physical input device for the human to interact and one or more output devices for the machine to interact. The most common input devices are keyboards, mice, gamepads, remote controls, touchscreens, and the most common output devices are for visual feedback like monitors or printers, or auditory feedback like speakers. But you can have output devices for all other human senses as well. One more well-known example would be the force feedback controller for consoles like the Xbox or the PlayStation, where you have feedback from the machine when the controller vibrates. So human interface guidelines are a set of rules to guide interaction between humans, and for this talk at least, desktops and mobile phones. Let's get on to some examples. There are many different human interface guidelines on the web. The most common ones, or the most well-known ones, are those for the large ecosystems. For example, Google Material Design for Android, iOS, Flutter, and the web. I guess everyone has seen it in some way or the other. Or Apple Human Interface Guidelines. Actually, Apple provides not one guideline, but four. While Google has one big guideline that covers everything, Apple provides a set of guidelines, one for macOS, one for iOS, one for watchOS, and one for tvOS. Of course, Microsoft has its own human interface guidelines too, or rather several of them. They have a guideline for the Universal Windows platform. They have one for Windows 32, one for Windows Presentation Foundations, and one for Windows Forms. And while Apple has four guidelines too, it's pretty straightforward which one to choose, depending on the device you want to develop for. But if you want to develop for Microsoft, you need to choose the human interface guideline depending on the technology you want to develop with. Or You need to choose the technology you want to develop with. If you want to develop against one particular human interface guideline. In my opinion, it's pretty unfortunate to have different human interface guidelines for different technologies because it makes it so much harder to choose. So then, of course, there's GNOME's human interface guidelines and KDE's human interface guidelines. Actually, when I started to work at KDE's human interface guidelines, we had a similar problem as Microsoft has now, or still has. We had two human interface guidelines you had to choose between, depending on the technology you wanted to develop this. On the one hand, there was the classic huge widget one, and on the other hand, there was a QML and Kirigami one with a new set of controls, UI elements, and navigational patterns. And to some extent, we still have this problem, but as QML and Kirigami matured, things improved quite a bit, and we are back to only have one guideline for both worlds. What all these human interface guidelines I just showed have in common, they cover a very, very wide range of devices, a wide range of use cases for applications. There are all kinds of applications in each of these environments. But there are human interface guidelines with a very different and very much narrowed scope as well. For example, there's a human interface guideline for LG's WebOS that are just narrowed in their scope, they're just for TVs. So they only target one class of devices and only a very reduced set of applications. The applications you typically find on a TV are smaller and less complex than in the other environments we saw earlier, and center around of the consume of media. But but also something like LibreOffice has its own set of guidelines. So it's not only human interface guidelines for platform, ecosystems, or devices, but there are human interface guidelines for applications, for single applications as well. Like you can see here from LibreOffice, or there's a human interface guideline from Blender. So after we saw some examples of different human interface guidelines you can find in the web, what role are they actually playing in an ecosystem? Let's see what some of the human interface guidelines themselves say about their role. This is from KDE. So the KDE Human Interface Guideline offers designers and developers a set of recommendations for producing beautiful, usable, and consistent user interfaces for convergent desktop and mobile applications and workspace widgets. Their aim is to improve the experience for users by making applications and widget interfaces more consistent and hence more intuitive and learnable. Let's take a look at the second one. This is from Google. Build beautiful products faster. Material is a design system that helps teams build high-quality digital experiences. Use our most popular design and development resources to jumpstart your latest project. They have pretty much, we have two core aspects mentioned in these human interface, in these descriptions. One, consistency, and the other one is speed up design and development. Consistency is about creating a sense of control, familiarity, and reliability for the user. Consistency increases usability. Something a user learned once can be applied over and over again in the same ecosystem. The other major point is human interface guidelines try to speed up design and development. For example, by providing design examples or giving standardized solutions for common problems. So how do human interface guidelines help in achieving these goals? Let's take a look at two core parts of typical user interface guidelines: navigation patterns and components, and how they help to achieve consistency and speed up development. Navigation patterns. Navigation patterns, something very fundamental for every app. Navigation patterns are the way a user is supposed to move through an application. There are several different ways a user could move through an application. You can move hierarchic up and down in an application. You can move lateral between the same level of in the application. You can reverse either in history or hierarchy, like going back in the browser or in the mobile applications. Or you can have jumps, like most hyperlinks in websites are, where you just jump from one point to the other without where you just jump directly. And there are lots and lots of navigation patterns to achieve this. Hamburger menus, tabs, vertical navigation, breadcrumbs, menus, bottom bars, expandable lists, wizards, collapsible content, dialogues, carousels, column-based navigation, and so on. Typically, you want only a subset of these patterns in your ecosystem. To choose the right one or the right ones, because most of the time one needs to combine multiple of these, is very fundamental to an app. The one key role of a human interface guideline is to help the designers and developers to choose the right pattern for an ecosystem, because not all patterns will fit into your ecosystem. Some patterns just fell out of time, like this collapsible sidebar panels in Mozilla's free Firefox web browser. So you would click on here and then the content would expand and the other content would collapse. I don't think this pattern is used anywhere anymore, at least not in a sidebar. Today you would probably use some kind of tabs on the top to switch between the contents, or a vertical sidebar. Some patterns work only for some screen sizes, like this vertical sidebar. It works great on a TV, on a mobile phone not so much because you don't have the space. Or they only work for some input methods, like touch is not as accurate as mouse, so the interface and the patterns need to adjust to it. And some patterns might just not fit the vision you have for your platform. For example, here we see different concepts for the secondary navigation in iOS and material design. Apple is using a More tab in the bottom bar to access navigation destinations that don't fit in the bottom bar. So if you want to go somewhere here, it doesn't fit in here, so you have to push the More button and then you have a tab with more navigation destinations. On the other hand, material design would use a sidebar to access additional navigation points in here. They are both probably equally viable, but if you want to have your app to be consistent in iOS, you need to choose the More tab. And if you want to develop for material design, you should choose the sidebar. And that's something a developer or designer cannot choose for himself. You have to give him hints. So let's talk about components. Yeah, another basic element of human interface guidelines. Components are smaller building blocks of UIs. Buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, tabs, cards, lists, and so on. Some general advice for human interface, if you create human interface guidelines for these components, give as much detail as possible. Details help to speed up design and development, and details improve consistency. You can see the difference in how much more detail Google puts in its material design documentation than Apple does in its iOS documentation. You have a width, you have a height, you have detailed paddings. On iOS, it's just an image. So when Google released material design in 2014, they were one of the first, or the first, to add so much details specs to their guidelines. And it was so much easier to reproduce these components for something new, a new programming language or a new framework. And it's so much easier when you look around for example, for web development frameworks. Every other web development framework looks like material design because it's so easy to recreate material design components in another technology. I searched around a bit to find one that follows Apple's human interface guidelines, and I think I found only one. But details, it's not only about expanding your ecosystem into new technologies or new toolkits, but it also helps with the creation of new controls. Sooner or later, some designer or developer will have the need for a new custom control to solve a problem that won't be covered by your human interface guidelines. So, just to showcase how this could work, let's say I created this very basic, maybe not overly useful and important component for my all-new material design app. It doesn't look like a material design component at all, and in fact it doesn't look very usable or pretty at the moment either. But we can easily improve it by just applying the detailed specs we find in the material design documentation. First, let's add the padding we saw in the button in the specification earlier. Now we have applied the padding here and here and here and here and here. Now it looks a lot better already. In the next step, let's apply the border radius typical for material components and add some drop shadow. Everything can be found in material design guidelines. Even better. But still not quite there. So let's take a look around material design documentation for a similar control we could use to get more specifications from. This is like this small card. So let's take the width and the height from this card and apply it together with the height we saw earlier on the button on our new control. Now it actually does look like some material design control. I'm too fast. It blends in nicely with other material design components. And because we use the same width as a standard card, we can easily use both of them together. So we could, for example, use them in the same container on the same page, store them together. It would work very nicely. And if I want to add an image like it's shown here in the card, I could just put it in here, use the same paddings and specify it over here, and improve my component even more. And in the process, only by applying all these specifications I found in the documentation in the human interface guideline, my component got much prettier and more usable as well. So especially applying the paddings makes it much better. Of course, I could do all this too if the documentation doesn't provide it. I could take a screenshot, open my drawing application and start measuring everything. It would take me hours and hours, and I would have to make a lot of guesses. Is it more important that the button has the width of 60 pixels, or is it more important that the padding is 16 pixels, or what happens if if the title gets too long? Is it going? Do I have to elide it, or is it just cut off? Is my button growing? I have to make a lot of guesses. What are the important values? What did the designers or the writers of the human interface guidelines aim for? That you can take all these specifications directly from the material design guidelines makes it so much faster and easier to design. And it helps you not to forget some things like a padding or a size or whatever. It's the same with the typing. So I could the type no. So if I want to have a title in my control, I could just copy the font sizes from the card. And it's something that all we are in the KDE human interface guidelines are missing a lot. We don't have a lot of details in our stuff, so it's hard to recreate them or to create them again. And we actually did recreate a lot because we had to create components in QML that already existed in Qt widgets. I'm sorry, I'm talking so fast that I'm pretty much through my presentation already. So to sum it up, human interface guidelines give more consistencies for an ecosystem. In design, they give more consistency in the interactions, and they speed up design and development, for example, by giving standardized solutions for common problems. Luckily, I see there are a lot of questions already in the notes. Today, all desktops have their own human interface guidelines, as they should. But for developers coming into the app ecosystem, would it be possible to have a minimum set of human interface guidelines for the app ecosystem without having to choose one? I think I don't quite understand the question. So you choose the ecosystem you want to develop for, and it typically comes along with a human interface guideline. So I don't know what you don't want to choose.
Hi, Fabian.
Hello.
Would you like me to read the questions for you, or are you okay?
I can read them too, but yeah, I'm fine with you reading them.
Okay. Say again.
You're welcome to read them.
Okay. Have you would you like me to take from the first question, or you want me to?
Sorry?
I'm going to be taking the first question. Have you attempted any of the questions? Okay. Can you hear me? I think can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm having some issues with my mic. 1 minute. Okay, so the second question, do you think designers from the various desktop projects will be able to collectively exchange ideas in a space like LAS or specific forum for designers on the Linux platform?
yes, I think they would, but at least for there are not so many designers because our approach to human interface guidelines is not directed from the top, rather, but so there's not a group that creates the human interface guidelines and everyone has to follow it, but it's more a process of documenting the actual development. And designers I talked mostly in the presentation are designers for applications, not for the not to write a human interface guidelines, because most designers are not no user interface or or user experience experts either. But of course, there could be a lot more collaboration between the desktops and a lot of exchange of ideas. And I think something like conference would work best, especially for design, is, in my opinion, very important to have personal face-to-face exchanges.
Mm. Okay, thank you so much. There's a third question. It says, are there any legal restrictions with regard to using material design outside Android?
Not as far as I know, but I'm not a legal expert.
Okay.
There's very many other projects that use material design.
Okay, so we still have more questions coming up for you, but then I'll go
Yeah.
to the fourth question. How do you suggest we approach conversation between desktop and mobile and applications that are developed to work on both?
Like I said in the beginning of my talk, I'm much more in writing and structuring the content and providing images and videos and stuff like this, and in actually creating user interface patterns or design patterns. So I think you have to ask someone else who's more expert in this area than me.
Okay, can I take the fifth question? It says, are there HIGs for VR/AR?
Yes.
Okay.
For example, Microsoft Universal Platform UWP, Universal Windows Platform covers also VR. At least they try to. That's what they say in it's in their documentation.
Okay, so we have someone trying to quickly get a question. So it says, does Microsoft HIG cover VR/AR for HoloLens then or other devices too?
I don't know. And I guess there are other human interface guidelines for other VR stuff, like from Steam or I don't know. But there are tons of human interface guidelines out on the web.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Fabian. Great talk on Women Interface Guidelines. If anyone would like to continue the conversation, there's a great conversation in the chat, and you can reach him out as well if you have any further questions. Thank you once again. It was great to have you on the talk. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank
So
you
I'm
very
going
much.
to take in the presenter from you right now.
Yes.
And we are going to be going on a break. So we're going to be going on a break to be coming back for the pub quiz. So for the meantime, once again, you might have to stretch your legs, take some tea, or possibly continue the conversation and the public chat, which is quite interesting anyway. So I'm going to be handing it over to Alison now to continue. Alison?
I don't think Alison is here, but now what we have to do is the closing because this was the last talk of LAS, right?
Oh yeah, great.
Okay, let me show myself. Neil, are you around here?
I am. Hello.
Hi.
Let's see if I can turn my webcam on. Ah.
Hi, Neil. Nice seeing you.
You too. You too.
Well, 2020, and we managed to do another LAS. Great stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an interesting year, shall we say? So yeah, I'm just really glad that everyone managed to come along and carry on talking about apps on Linux and how we can carry on driving that forward.
Yeah, I think that we've had great content. We've had well, good conversations. Obviously, it's not the same as last year where we got to do it around a beer, but we went to the Amalfi Coast, so there's that.
Absolutely. Some interesting themes this year as well. So a fair amount more around how we can basically make sure that app authors can, even free software app authors, can basically get money out of what they do for Linux as well. That's something I haven't really kind of seen highlighted too much before. Anything new you kind of saw around there, Alex?
Yeah, well, that's what we were after as well, right? We want LAS to be the place where these things can become a reality. And I think that indeed we saw a lot of that. We've been seeing also more talks about topics beyond the actual obvious technical topics, right? Which, I mean, they're interesting because we're technologists, all of us, but we all know that these products go far beyond to the zeros and ones that we're so accustomed with. I just realized we didn't introduce ourselves. Maybe it's worth doing. I am Aleix. I am the president of the KDV, one of the organizations that is organizing the LAS. And Neil?
Yeah, I'm Neil McGovern. I'm the executive director of the GNOME Foundation. Again, one of the co-organizers of LAS.
Yes. Well, unless you have something very important you want to say.
Yeah, just a final thank you to our sponsors.
Yeah.
As always. Yeah, so a huge special thank you to our champion sponsors, which was Ubuntu and Collabora. Yep, Canonical and Collabora. And then, of course, to all our other sponsors throughout, who's always helped with putting this on, especially in a time where we weren't really sure how things were going to look or going to end up. end up looking like, then we're really grateful for everyone's support.
Yeah, well, those are good things. Elementary, Red Hat, and OpenSUSE. Thank you very much. Without the support, it wouldn't be possible to do these things. And well, hopefully next year we can do it again in person or not, whatever the world looks like.
Absolutely. And I guess thanks everyone for a few other thanks for all the wonderful volunteers who've come and help sort of shepherd talks together, to all our great speakers, and then everyone for coming along as well.
Yeah, maybe it would make sense if the organizers who are around in this room could turn on the camera for a second and wave. Oh, hi, Alison.
Hey.
Hi.
And hi, Nuritsi. Hi, Christy.
Well, and those who are shy as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for making a wonderful team and pulling this off all together. And a big round of applause for Kenny.
Yeah. It's weird, the virtual kind of rounds of applause, right? In a conference room, it makes sense. Here it's like, well, last thing that is gonna happen for LAS will be in a couple of hours, if I'm not mistaken. It will be
an hour and 20 minutes.
So at 9 UTC.
Yes.
There's a pub quiz. Alison will host us with some colleagues. Join us. No need to bring a beer. You can bring a beer. There will be questions that you get to answer and test yourself against your Linux peers.
Absolutely. It's going to be a lot of fun, and hopefully some jokes come out of it. I know I'm going to go get a drink and my favorite snack to get through the hour. And yeah, I can't wait to see everyone there. And thank you for a wonderful 3 days of conference.
All right. See you in a bit. And goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.